forgive me all of my copious notes here, which I will be referring to. Believe me, you don't want me to go off script. My wife says that I need a GPS to get to the point. So I always try to keep this very low-tech teleprompter on hand so that I don't stray, so I don't digress everywhere. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak to you all today about this critical topic of school shootings. Dr. Warren Farrell is a very tough act to follow, and there will probably be a little bit of overlap in what I have to say, but I hope I can still offer a little bit of insight from a slightly different perspective. As a writer, as Karen said, I usually focus on the intersection of politics and culture. For example, I've written a lot about Hollywood and terrorism. I've written a lot about media bias. And increasingly over the last few years, I have been writing about what is often referred to as the war on masculinity. Now, I'm reluctant to use the phrase war on anything because it can sound a bit melodramatic, and I feel that I worry sometimes that terms like war on masculinity, war on women, war on Christmas, war on poverty, they diminish the power of the word war itself, which should be reserved for the shock and awe of actual war. On the other hand, I do think it's fair to say that war on masculinity is a legitimate expression because there does exist a concerted, subversive campaign in the Western world to attack and eradicate the very notion of masculinity as part of a broader assault on the traditions and values of Western civilization. That subversive campaign is called cultural Marxism, which is the application of Marxist aims to the cultural arena instead of just to economics, because Marxist aims don't work out too well in the economic arena, but they succeed very well in the cultural arena. The assault on masculinity is the most critical front of that subversive campaign because once the enemies of masculinity sell the idea that male and female are false social constructs rather than biological truths, and that masculinity is inherently misogynist, violent, oppressive, and toxic, and it must be deconstructed in order to pave the way for a Marxist utopia. Once that's done, then the family unit will disintegrate for good, equality will be our God, the state will become our father, and there will be no force left to defend the West from its enemies, both internal and external. An emasculated culture is a doomed culture. A civilization whose men are confused or insecure about their masculinity and who will not or cannot protect and defend their women is signaling that it is weak and ripe for conquering. I'll give you one example of the stunning degree to which Western men have succumbed to this confusion and lack of confidence about manhood. No doubt you have heard about the mass sexual assaults in various European cities on New Year's Eve a couple of years ago. Thousands of them committed by Muslim migrants and their rape culture that the European elites have imported into the continent. After those sexual assaults, hundreds of Dutch men, in Amsterdam, if I remember right, and only hundreds, decided to march for the victims. So to show their solidarity with the assaulted women, the men marched in skirts. Now, who in here thinks that that's going to strike fear into the heart of a hyper-masculinized Muslim culture that is metastasizing throughout Europe? And not only that, but the authorities' pathetic response to these rapes was not to bring the hammer down on the perpetrators, but instead to urge women to travel in groups, dress more modestly, avoid going out at night, and the best of all, wear temporary tattoos that read "No." I am not making this up. Yeah, that's going to discourage rape gangs. Okay, well, now you're saying, okay, Mark, that's in Europe, but what about in the United States? Where do we see the war on masculinity playing out here? Well, I'll just give you one more abstract example. You can see it in the depictions of fatherhood on TV in the last several decades. Over the course of essentially one generation, our TV role models from fatherhood have degenerated from the wise, compassionate, morally upright authority figure of Andy Griffith in the Andy Griffith Show of the 1960s to 20 or so years later, the bumbling, lazy buffoon Homer for the animated show The Simpsons, whom his children barely tolerate, much less respect. That's a significant cultural shift. Traditional masculinity is now maligned as sexist, classist, even racist, and certainly archaic. Some among the radical left don't even bother to conceal their animosity toward it anymore. One blogger, a leftist blogger, condemned masculinity as, quote, a cancer incompatible with modernity. It is one of the most destructive forces in the world and must be destroyed. Traditional masculinity has to die in just the same way that sexism and racism and homophobia have to die. It can't be reformed, it can't be rescued, it has to be replaced, unquote. In another example, the UK Guardian posted an op-ed called, "It's time to do away with the concept of manhood altogether." A writer named Waller Newell, who has done a lot of thoughtful writing about masculinity, wrote in an article titled "The Crisis of Masculinity" that, quote, "as a culture, we've never been more conflicted about what we mean by manhood," unquote. He was addressing the damage that had been done by decades of what he called social engineering throughout our public and educational institutions to eradicate any psychological differences between men and women in order to deconstruct the supposedly patriarchal structure of our society. That article is 20 years old. Waller Newell could not have foreseen how much more critical this crisis of masculinity has become. And there are various aspects of this crisis of masculinity. Dr. Farrell touched on some of it, and I'll just briefly mention a few things here. Boys and men aren't succeeding in school and college anymore the way that girls and women are. They're losing dominance in the workplace, and in fact, we're facing what's being called a quiet catastrophe of millions of American men in their prime working years who are not only unemployed, but who have chosen to drop out of the labor force. Now, work is essential to dignity, to a sense of purpose, to being a productive member of society. Without that, a man slips into an aimless purgatory. His personal relationships suffer, his community suffers, the culture suffers. Meanwhile, a half-century of radical feminism has left men confused and paralyzed and resentful toward women. There's no longer a culturally agreed-upon set of standards of behavior for boys and men to understand what makes a man, what a man's duties and responsibilities are, and even how a man treats a woman. And one result of this is that young men are increasingly refusing to get involved in long-term relationships with women. This has far-reaching ramifications, not least of which is the declining birth rate in the Western world. So in essence, American men and boys are adrift economically, psychologically, morally, spiritually, and even physically. The U.S. Army has had to initiate a tougher and longer basic training program because incoming recruits lack the discipline and the physical fitness of previous generations. A study of men's grip strength recently revealed that millennial men are not only significantly weaker than their father's generation, they are no stronger than millennial women are today. I am not making this up, once again. All of this is true. Everything I say is true. To quote Jordan Peterson, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, a clinical psychologist who has become the most popular public intellectual since Joseph Campbell in the early 80s, Jordan Peterson says, on a deep level, the West has lost faith in the idea of masculinity. And that spells trouble. So what does all this have to do with school shootings? Well, let me zero in on a specific example, the Parkland High School shooting in Florida on Valentine's Day. That incident understandably ramped up our national conversation about gun control, but it also threw fire on an already incendiary conversation that we were having about the broader issue of violence and masculinity. Critics pointed to this Parkland shooter as yet another example of a male, a male mass murderer, something that women very rarely do, and therefore, many argued, the underlying problem of gun violence, in fact, in violence in general, clearly must be the toxic nature of masculinity itself. Toxic masculinity. This is a concept that was created many years ago by feminist writers to explain the root of all male misbehavior. But it's become practically a household buzz phrase now, overnight. It's talked about a lot in the media, and it's used to explain virtually every evil plaguing mankind, from greed to unhealthy competition to domestic violence to war. You name it, and not just men, but the poisonous nature of masculinity itself is blamed for it. The Parkland shooting was a perfect opportunity to push this concept, So let me read you a handful of media headlines regarding the shooting. We need to talk about how toxic masculinity is killing America. Men are responsible for mass shootings. How toxic masculinity is killing us. Guns don't kill people. Men and boys kill people, experts say. Don't blame mental illness for mass shootings. Blame men. Toxic white masculinity, the killer that haunts American life. And last, when will we begin to label masculinity as having gone mad? Boys and men now are constantly assaulted through cultural messages that they are broken, that their very nature is poisonous, and that they are ticking time bombs of violent rage. They are told that they suffer behind a so-called mask of masculinity, and they can only be free to be themselves when they throw off this mask, reject their nature, and embrace their suppressed feminine side. Boys are told, in essence, that they are nothing more than broken girls, and they need to be fixed. Now, this notion that traditional male, we'll call it stoicism, constitutes an outmoded caricature of manhood is a constant refrain in discussions of masculinity today. The new ideal of masculinity seems to be a man who is narcissistically absorbed in exploring his own feelings, a man neutered of the outward-looking drive for achievement and adventure, and yes, even the capacity for violence that is part of his nature. There's a reason that men traditionally are more emotionally reserved than women. Throughout history, men have been the providers and the protectors, the hunters and the warriors, the builders and the trailblazers, and those duties demand no small measure of emotional toughness and restraint. That is no less true of life in today's urban jungle. In fact, studies show that emotionality may protect women from stress, but it does not protect men from it. Men best combat stress through self-control. Thank you. Good morning. Your check is in the mail. Now, let me just say that there are certain unhealthy masks of masculinity that boys and men are pressured to wear, and I certainly don't believe it's a positive thing for men to be emotionally repressed, but it is possible to take this idea too far and use it to pressure men to reject who they actually are and who they could be. An important hallmark of masculinity is to be enough in control of your emotions to take care of business when necessary. Critics of masculinity are very fond of saying phrases like "suck it up and be a man" or "man up" are damaging. And depending on the boy or the man and the context, they could be. But if a man isn't capable of manning up when the situation calls for it, then he suffers for it. More importantly, his loved ones suffer for it. His community suffers for it, his country suffers for it, and his civilization suffers for it. All of that suffers when he's told that his masculine nature is oppressive and violent and hateful, and that what he really needs is a good public cry. No matter how loudly a minority of voices in the culture declare otherwise, no woman wants a man to be cuddled, who needs to be cuddled every night after work to keep it together. Women want a husband and a father for their children whom they can count on in times of stress, emergency, and danger to be a pillar of strength and resistance. Now, that is a demanding responsibility, but a sacred one. In any case, being a man, or being a good man anyway, is not a measure of how macho or in touch with one's feminine side a man is, but about the values he lives by and how committed he is to upholding them. More about that in a moment. Let me get back to the Parkland shooting. After that Parkland shooting, one of the key drivers of the social media discussion about this shooting was comedian actor Michael Ian Black, who posted a long Twitter thread in which he talked about how masculinity was in crisis, that men were broken and they didn't know how to express it or talk about it, much less how to fix it. In an interview after this social media conversation with NPR, Black was asked what he thinks healthy masculinity looks like. "I don't know," he answered. "I mean, I really don't." And there is the rub. In our national conversation about masculinity, there is far more emphasis on how men are inherently broken and bad than there is on what makes them whole and good. The critics of toxic masculinity can easily point to what that looks like, but few, if any, can articulate what constitutes the opposite, what healthy masculinity looks like, apart from men erasing their own nature and acting more like stereotypical women, being less aggressive, less competitive, more emotional, more nurturing and vulnerable. These critics, quite frankly, want men to be emasculated and for women to embody the worst characteristics of toxic masculinity: promiscuous, foul-mouthed, aggressively ambitious. But if you just look beyond the dark side of the Parkland shooting, you would have seen precisely the kind of masculinity that Michael Ian Black could not identify. You would have seen the very antidote to toxic masculinity. That antidote is chivalry. Chivalry, you say? Well, what does opening doors for a woman have to do with school shootings? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because I just finished writing a book about chivalry, literally just finished it, so the publisher hasn't even given it a title yet, and I don't know exactly when it will be out, but I will keep Karen and the AFA apprised of info about that, and perhaps they can share it when the time comes. I obviously hope that you'll get a copy, and even better, I urge you to get 2 copies in case you feel like rereading it. Most people think that chivalry is about manners and courtesy, and that is certainly part of it. But originally, and I go into the whole history of it in my book, originally it was a code of male ethics, a set of values to commit to that guided men in their behavior as men. There wasn't one single code of chivalry. There were numerous codes, but they all overlapped in certain values that included honesty, honor, courage, and a commitment to defending the defenseless. And that's where the Parkland shooting comes in. Drowned out amid all this deafening outrage about gun control and toxic masculinity were numerous inspirational examples of chivalric masculinity which manifested itself that day. Several of the high school's staff and students, particularly ROTC students, precisely the kind of program that the left would like to eliminate, those students and staff members put their lives on the line to protect others at that school. Some of them lost their lives. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to talk about these instances in detail and mention them by name, because in the aftermath of a school shooting, it's always the shooter whose name lives on in infamy, while the names of the victims and heroes often are quickly forgotten by the media. Aaron Feiss, assistant football coach and security guard, ran toward the sound of gunfire, as heroes do. He pushed one female student out of the line of fire and was killed as he shielded 2 others with his body. The Broward County Sheriff, who knew Feiss personally, said when Aaron Feiss died, he died protecting others, because that's who Aaron Feiss was. Geography teacher Scott Beigel, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name, he was killed after he unlocked a classroom door for students to enter and to hide from the gunman. One of those students said, when he opened the door, he had to relock it so we could stay safe, but he didn't get the chance to. The shooter probably didn't know we were in there because the teacher was lying on the floor. If the shooter had come in the room, I wouldn't be alive. Chris Hickson, the school's athletic director and a Navy vet, was killed as he too ran toward the sound of gunfire and tried to help fleeing students. I'm beyond proud that he didn't even think of himself in that moment, his wife said. He just thought of the safety of everyone else. Student Peter Wang was last seen in his junior ROTC uniform, holding doors open so that others could get out more quickly. He and 2 other ROTC victims, Elena Petty and Martin Duke, were all posthumously honored by the U.S. Army with the ROTC Medal for Heroism. Wang was buried in his uniform and was given a rare posthumous admission to the U.S. Military Academy. 2 17-year-old ROTC captains, Zachary Walls and Colton Hobb, herded dozens of students and teachers into a classroom and noticed that the large hanging curtains in the room were made of Kevlar, which is what bulletproof vests are made of. So they made a wall of the material between the door and the students. They used 2 tables to barricade the door, and they stood next to it with 2x4s, quote, ready to do what we had to do if someone came in the room, unquote. That's what one of the captains said. The shooter never did come into that room, but Walls and Hobb exhibited amazing courage, ingenuity, leadership, and presence of mind in protecting others. 15-year-old Anthony Borges was shot 5 times as he used his body to barricade the door of a classroom where 20 other students were inside. He miraculously survived. One shooter, many heroes. If school shooters are a prime example of toxic masculinity, then what the Parkland High School's staff and ROTC members exhibited was the polar opposite. They demonstrated the heroic degree of selfless courage that is the hallmark of chivalry. It's a masculinity that the critics of masculinity never talk about because it puts the lie to the notion that masculinity is toxic. The point is that while there will always be bad men, evil men, broken men, the antidote is not less masculinity, but more of it, more of the right kind. Chivalry is that right kind. The aim should be to encourage our young men to embrace their masculine nature while teaching them to tame it and temper it with wisdom and virtue and character. Boys and men need a code, a set of values and vows to civilize them, discipline them, elevate, and empower them. A modernized revival of chivalry would help give morally adrift young men a code that speaks to their scorned, suppressed masculine nature and that sets them on the path to becoming productive citizens of integrity and strength. If we rescue our men and set them on the right path, everything else will fall into place. Our broken families, our divided communities, our decadent culture, our waning civilization. That is why we need chivalry. Now, the problem is that while older people like myself just naturally see chivalry as a positive social force, it is a reviled concept among younger generations. Millennials, both men and women, hold a visceral anger about it that is indicative of decades of cultural and academic indoctrination that have demonized the concept of chivalry into near obsolescence. Millennial women are offended by chivalry because they see it as sexist and oppressive. In fact, it's called benevolent sexism, in contrast with hostile sexism like rape and wife-beating, because benevolent sexism seems harmless and respectful, but in fact it's considered worse than hostile sexism because it's subtle and subversive. I'm not making this up. Millennial men believe that chivalry aids and abets the very radical feminism that has assaulted their manhood for 50 years. They're sick of being disrespected by feminists and resent the expectation that men should have to give women special treatment. Their attitude now is we'll start acting like gentlemen when women start acting like ladies. So there's a knee-jerk resistance to chivalry from the very people who need to learn to embrace it. The challenge then is to break down this resistance and to begin to educate young people about it. Toward that end, I am in the process of creating a nonprofit organization that will bring a historical and moral education about chivalry into schools and impact the culture in other ways as well. What are some of the qualities of chivalry that we should cultivate? Well, let me just touch on a few of the most important. First and foremost, I think, is service. A commitment to serve others and to serve something higher than oneself. This does not sit well with our narcissistic culture. It includes coming to the defense of the defenseless, male or female, which also doesn't sit well with millennial men who feel that they owe nothing to women. Courage. A scholar of chivalry once wrote that the gentleman is, quote, everywhere and always the champion of the right and the good against injustice and evil, unquote. And that requires courage. Honor. Now, this is a complicated concept, and it gets more complicated the more you look into it. There's a gentleman who's just put out a book about why honor matters, and he's actually promoting it, but even he admits in the book that he doesn't know how to define it. But what I'm talking about when I say honor as a chivalric virtue is a personal standard of integrity and moral responsibility, as distinct from an honor culture, the kind of honor culture in which wives and daughters are stoned to death because they've impugned the family honor in some way. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a personal standard of behavior. Humility. Arrogance is not the hallmark of a gentleman or a hero. And there was once a time when heroes fought for glory. Achilles, for example, they fought for personal glory. But our culture over time has shifted from that. We don't have a heroism like that. Today, our heroism is focused on service, which is a positive thing. You hear a lot of people called heroes now who say, I'm no hero. I just did what I felt like I had to do. Achilles would never have said that. Now, these aren't new or original concepts, nothing that I made up. They're time-tested values, however, and they sound hopelessly traditional. But things traditional today are routinely scorned and dismissed as old-fashioned and out of touch in our age of irony and mockery and cynicism. But tradition is not about worshiping the ashes, but about passing on the fire. I wish I'd written that. That was actually the composer Gustav Mahler who said that. The way forward for men is not to reject traditional masculinity and its virtues and duties, but to reach back, take the torch of chivalry, and light their way with it. I am very passionate about advancing the cause of chivalry because I want to see a world in which men are better fathers and sons and husbands. I have 3 very young daughters, and I'm teaching them to take care of themselves and to defend themselves. Nevertheless, I want them to grow up in a world in which chivalry reigns, in which good men will not hesitate to stand up and protect them from bad men. Now, I hear you saying, that's fantastic, Mark. I'm totally on board with you. But what can I do? And that's the hard part, because it's easy to recommend action items for political change, like voting for candidates who are staunch defenders of the First and Second Amendments. It's much more difficult to recommend action items for cultural change. It's difficult to have even a small impact on the culture if you don't own a movie studio or a media publication or host a late-night talk show. So it has to be personal. And what you can do is recognize when and where the forces of cultural Marxism are working to diminish and demonize men and resist those forces. I'll give you an example. Don't consent to the bullying demands of gender-confused bullies that demand that you use their made-up personal pronouns. Women, thank you. Women expect and even demand chivalrous behavior from the men in your lives. Raise your, you're texting the mail too. Raise your boys to be modern knights. For that matter, raise your girls to be modern knights. That's what I'm doing. Chivalric values are actually human virtues. But I stress the masculine aspect of this because boys and men are in crisis and women and girls are not. And because, as the iconoclastic culture critic Camille Paglia has said, it's a man's world and always will be. So if we want a better world, if we want not only fewer school shootings, but more men stepping up to be heroes when those shootings occur, then we need better men. And men, as the first century Jewish religious leader Hillel said, in the place where there are no men, strive to be a man. Thank you. Thank you.